Some people and even Wikipedia would have us believe that Resident Evil 4 redefined the survival horror genre. But it didn't redefine anything. Capcom left survival horror behind and made an action game. Survival horror is a subgenre of the action genre, so this is a step backwards, not forwards. You might think for that reason that I dislike Resident Evil 4, like some disgruntled old man talking about how things were better in my day. But that's not the case. In fact, I love Resident Evil 4, and it is quite easily the best action game on the GameCube. But I must say that the feeling is bittersweet. On the one hand, I enjoyed playing Resident Evil 4, but on the other hand, I know that Resident Evil 4 was the game that really paved the way for the killing off of the survival horror genre. It set an example in the gaming industry which a lot of other game series has followed. So why is Resident Evil 4 an action game and not a survival horror game? I'll start off with the most obvious point, one which you'd already be familiar with if you watched Antisocial Fat Man's Dead Space 2 review. He had a much better way with words, so I'm just going to quote him, and of course replace Dead Space 2 with Resident Evil 4. Although survival is an element of Resident Evil 4, it's no more an element of Resident Evil 4 than it is to any other game where you can die. Gears of War is no less about survival than Resident Evil 4, but nobody's calling it a survival horror. Although Antisocial Fat Man said that about Dead Space 2, it also applies to Resident Evil 4. Before I talk about gameplay, which is pretty much the biggest factor when defining a genre, I first want to talk about the scenario we are in. After all, if this is a survival horror like some people think, then what exactly is it we're trying to survive from in Resident Evil 4? In earlier Resident Evil games we had enemies like the aptly named Hunter or the Nemesis who literally hunted you throughout the entire game. If anything, we assume the role of the hunter. So who is hunting us in Resident Evil 4, or what are we trying to survive from? Your mission in the game is pretty much the same as any Call of Duty level ever designed, or any other first person shooter for that matter. And that mission is to infiltrate the base, or village or castle in this case, and kill everything that moves. If anything, it's the enemies who are trying to survive the onslaught of Leon. Because of course, like in any other action game, you are more powerful than the enemy. Unlike in survival horror games where you should play as a vulnerable character. In fact, I'm going to make that a golden rule. One that Resident Evil 4 has broken right at the get-go. Golden rule number 6. Playing as a vulnerable character compared to the enemies you're fighting. And let's take a look at the other golden rules while we're on the subject. So let's start off with golden rule number 1, scarce resources. Capcom broke this rule as soon as they let the enemies drop ammo. This happens pretty much whenever you need it, so you really never run out of ammo. And I can sympathise with Capcom in this rule, because in this day and age if you did run out of ammo in a game, a lot of people would complain about it and say that it was bad game design. That is unless golden rule number 5 is intact, having to evade the enemies. That way if you do run out of ammo, you can still complete the game or get past the part you're stuck on, and it would just add to the tension and the fear. In most parts of Resident Evil 4, you have to eliminate all enemies to progress to the next part, which again is an attribute of the action genre. And now with precision aiming and upgradable weapons, golden rule number 2 no longer applies. You control your attack by being accurate, or by upgrading your weapon. And with some of these weapons you can pretty much fully upgrade them to the point where you become untouchable. And with no fear of taking damage from the enemies, there is no longer a sense of horror. There are however quite a few unexpected attacks. I would compare this to a cheaply made horror movie, one that only scares you by raising the volume and quickly flashing something on screen for a cheap scare. The problem with these attacks is of course that once you know they're there, they're no longer scary, and they don't leave a sustained feeling of horror, because you just get right back into the action. Puzzle solving is one attribute that has been left over from the other Resident Evil games, but it's much more streamlined in Resident Evil 4, and without the other rules intact, puzzle solving does nothing to Resident Evil 4's status as being a survival horror. It just makes it feel like an action game with puzzles, and much easier puzzles to its predecessors. But these rules only apply when you're playing as Leon, not as Ashley. With Ashley, however, it does feel a lot more like a survival horror. You play as a much more vulnerable character, who starts off with absolutely nothing in her inventory, and who, I might add, wears a dangerously short skirt. So for that reason you could say that golden rule number 1 applies: scarce resources, considering you have pretty much no resources. Certainly no weapons of any kind, which is how a lot of survival horrors start, with weapons or no weapons that you can barely defend yourself with. Ashley's only form of defense are these oil lamps you get to throw at the enemies, but there's no control over exactly where you throw them, and you're not guaranteed how successful that'll be. All they really do is give you a chance to slow the enemies down so you can move on to the next part. So of course, without having any control over your attack, you'll have to evade the enemies. Even Ashley's puzzles are more difficult. They're a lot more like the iconic puzzles from Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3, and at least they require some level of intelligence, rather than just spinning an analog stick round and round or tapping a button. And finally we have surprise attacks in the form of the knights who drop their axes, giving Ashley only a couple of seconds to dive out of the way, which of course reveals up Ashley's skirt. It's almost as if Capcom have put camera angles in the game which tend to focus on Ashley's ass, just to keep the viewer from turning the game off. It's like they're hedging their bets. On the one hand they're still trying to appeal to the survival horror fans, but on the other hand they're trying to appeal to action fans and perverts. I mean, take for example this part here where I'm climbing the ladder. I have no control over the camera angle, but is it me or is it really just focusing on Ashley's ass? I mean, what age is Ashley anyway? Should we really be focusing on her ass? Maybe I'm just being prudent, but I really don't think Capcom had to stoop that low when trying to spice this game up. But in the very small parts that you do play as Ashley, it really gives you a sense of what the game could have been like as a survival horror with an over-the-shoulder camera angle. And this proves that it could have worked if Capcom made the entire game like this. But it's pointless to speculate on what Capcom could have made. Instead, we should examine what they actually did make, and that is an action game. Some people call this genre action horror, but I just find those two words contradict each other. It'd be like if you had a genre called historical sci-fi or reality fantasy. Survival horror works as a genre because the two go hand in hand. You would associate excitement with action, not fear. So now that we've established that it's an action game, is that such a bad thing? Well, for me, yes, because it doesn't feel like a Resident Evil game now. And maybe not even because of the genre or the gameplay. The level design is unlike any Resident Evil game I've ever played. Wait, am I in the fire temple? Is that a dragon shooting out lava from its mouth? Have I put the wrong game in? Seriously though, Resident Evil 4 couldn't be any less like the original Resident Evils. Fighting non-zombie Spaniards in castles and villages just feels nothing like a Resident Evil game to me. I'm used to fighting zombies in tight corridors in either a mansion, a city, or any other number of synonymous zombie locations. But can anyone else honestly tell me that they felt like they were playing a Resident Evil game? In, for example, this part which is completely surrounded by lava. This honestly could have been copy and pasted from a fire temple in Zelda. The only thing that comes to mind that has any resemblance to an older Resident Evil game is some of the characters. And more than half of the characters in Resident Evil 4 are completely new. Which raises the question, why did Capcom even call it a Resident Evil game when it shares very little resemblance to a Resident Evil game? Why didn't they just call it Haunted Spaniard Castle? They could have easily just made up a new main character. The obvious answer is to guarantee sales. By slapping a Resident Evil name on it, they were pretty much guaranteed that at least half of the people who played the older Resident Evil games would buy it. It's hard to get a new game series up and running, but this way Capcom could have their cake and eat it. They could make a completely new game and be sure that it would be at least somewhat successful. And Resident Evil 4 was way beyond somewhat successful. And not because of the name, but because it was an action game, and a brilliant action game. My next video is going to be Resident Evil 5, where I'll show you how Capcom really milked the Resident Evil series. Remember to subscribe for the next video, and thanks for watching, guys.